A place in the spirit, these mountains, shimmering sky, a sea of forest land, fertile valleys and sheltered coves, nourished by crystalline waters. Majestic peaks rise like spires, heavenward in an endless horizon. Wave upon wave of blue-misted mountains seem to echo on forever, out of sight. The southern Appalachian Mountains have always stirred the soul, offering a promise of rebirth, renewal, beginnings. Little wonder that so many have been drawn here, so many by inspiration. Early settlers in the 18th and 19th century came here for a variety of reasons, looking for wide open spaces, looking to make a stake of their own, farm a little plot of land, give their families a future. Many were religious dissenters, like the hardy, self-reliant Scotch-Irish who journeyed across the rugged expanse of these mountains. The peaks and valleys reminded them of their ancestral home across the water. They came seeking independence and freedom, far from religious intolerance. These pioneers had come so far to find such a place here in the mountains, a place so far, yet so very near to God. The endless horizons and lofty mountaintops offered spiritual promise, but life here also exacted a harsh toll. In this untamed land, life was very hard for early settlers. Food, clothing, and shelter had to come by hand, be drawn from the earth by back-breaking labor. Men, women, and children alike. Hardship gave no quarter to anyone. But through it all, the fierce independence and determination to make a stake in this new land survived, nourished by a strong and unwavering belief in God.
There were no permanent colonial settlers west of the Blue Ridge in the central and southern mountains of North Carolina before the 1780s because this land was considered Cherokee Indian land. The new settlers brought with them, among other things, the Christian religion. In the mountains, the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Presbyterians were the predominant religious groups from the early settlement days. Although the churches had their share of disagreements and splits, they were a cohesive force in the mountain communities. They were not only strong advocates of morality, but they also were generally strong advocates of education. They often established elementary schools and academies with their ministers usually serving as the teacher. The people here had to depend on one another for survival in many instances, and the church played an important part in that survival process.
With the flow of settlement making its way into the mountains, communities flourished. Churches grew up at crossroads and along trading paths. Religious missions founded by the Baptist, Presbyterians, Methodist, and Episcopalians, by way of the traveling circuit-riding preacher on horseback, helped form the foundation of religious life in the remote corners of these mountains.
The church is the people and not just the building. But the buildings, particularly the older buildings, have enduring qualities and integrity, and they stand as sentinels all across the Appalachian landscape, and they are an integral part of the culture of this region.
Down any back road, on a gentle rise, or hugging a creek bank are the old country churches of the southern Appalachians. Some were Spartan in their simplicity. Some were built with a more ornate European influence of Anglican forebears. Other churches seem to rise straight from the mountains themselves. Fashioned from native stone which lined the creeks and riverbeds, or sheathed in sturdy wood drawn from abundant forest all about. These churches, most dating from the turn of the century, some earlier, are important landmarks in the spiritual landscape of the southern Appalachians. Up in the high country near Boone sits splendid Poplar Grove Baptist Church. This turn-of-the-century structure has many typical architectural and decorative elements found on rural churches of the period, but it also possesses a unique character all its own. Resembling a house as well as a church building, Poplar Grove is a welcoming place. Obvious pride in the community and the church is reflected in the warm decorative design. The lovely Gothic arched windows are enhanced by imaginative illustration. An attractive open belfry commands the hill, sending its ringing invitation far and wide. The tireless mission ministers, the circuit-riding preachers of yesteryear, were in large part responsible for the spread of the Word of God in the most rugged and remote corners of the southern Appalachians. The history of St. John's Episcopal Church in lovely Valley Crucis near Boone reflects this tremendously important part of the cultural and religious heritage of the mountains of North Carolina.
St. John's was built in 1862. St. John's was one of many mission churches that were built in the various hills and hollows close to Valley Crucis, primarily under the leadership of William West Skiles, who was a deacon in the Episcopal Church. Skiles he organized the congregations, he conducted services, as well as helped in the physical building and construction of the church. In the 19th century, St. John's was a vital congregation in the lower Watauga area. It formerly was built on a location just down the river. Moved in 1882 to higher ground because of flooding. And the remains of Deacon Skiles were also moved up here. The building had become and remains to some extent something of a memorial to Skiles and his ministry that included everything from providing pastoral care, medical care, education, just becoming a friend to the local person. He was an agronomist by trade, agriculturalist, so he could identify with the local folks. And the church was a place of social gathering, not only on Sundays, but it was a place that everybody gathered, everybody identified with. The materials we find were all donated, given by folks here off of their properties back in around 1860-62. And we think that there's of course chestnut and pine. Construction was done by local folks here because it was their church and it served their needs in this particular community.
In rural Allegheny County, bordered to the north by the state of Virginia, is the charming little Glade Valley Presbyterian Church, the site of many a picturesque wedding. Sheltered by a grove of mature trees, this tiny frame church, founded around 1902, is fortunate to be protected by a local preservation and restoration effort from nearby Sparta and its hilltop home community of Glade Valley. The church's vertical lines are typical of turn-of-the-century Gothic revival and are highlighted by the attractive triangular window clusters. A handsome church sits on a commanding hill near the community of Catoogachi, not far from Franklin in rural Macon County. Gillespie Chapel is one of the finest examples of the perpetuation of tradition and reverence for the church family in the southern Appalachians. Built in 1889 by a local builder, Zeb Conley, Gillespie Chapel is an exceptionally well-preserved example of a rural belfried frame church. The polygonal bell tower still wears its original hand-hewn shake shingles. Walk inside to the 19th century. The old pot-bellied stove in the corner, the simple wooden pews. There on the walls, spread with great pride, are row after row of sepia photographs. Fathers, mothers, children, families, good friends, and good times of long ago. Visual evidence of the permanence and tradition of Gillespie Chapel. In the shadow of magnificent Mount Mitchell, the highest mountain peak east of the Mississippi, is Yancey County. All along its winding country roads are a wealth of tiny frame churches, simple guardians of the religious life of these hardy settlers who found their way here to this land along well-worn Indian trails several centuries ago. One of these churches is Laurel Branch Baptist Church near Pensacola, north of Burnsville. Built in 1902, This tiny church served the once thriving timber town at Pensacola. It was the hub of activity at the turn of the century as railroads made their way across the mountains, clearing away some of the isolation and lumbering the forest as they went. The CC&O Railroad ran regular passenger trains from Pensacola. The clean lines and simple interior of Laurel Branch Baptist Church reflects the Spartan values of the people who settled there. Good, decent, hard-working folks, possessed of an unwavering faith in God. Sitting in a little dell at a crossroads, embraced by the meadows all around, is Price's Creek Union Church. In its clean lines, this church, founded in 1908, is typical of the rather simple churches found in Yancey County at the time. The foundation is fieldstone, rock gathered no doubt from the fields and forest nearby. The only variation from this simple design are the fanciful wood cutouts on the belfry. A star framed in a circle is placed halfway up the bell tower, and heart cutouts face each other tip to tip above the star nearest the roof line. This delicate ornamentation strikes a poignant chord and reveals much about the spirit of the congregation. In remote Ashe County are Holy Trinity Church on a hilltop in Glendale Springs and St. Mary's Church just outside West Jefferson. The Episcopal parish served by these twin churches is relatively small, but thousands visit the lovely frame Carpenter Gothic-style churches each year, chiefly for the wealth of artwork they're home to. Fresco artist Ben Long, a North Carolina native, produced the exquisite Renaissance-style representations of the Last Supper, the Mystery of Faith depicting the crucifixion of Christ, and the portraits Mary Great with Child and John the Baptist, which grace these holy sanctuaries. The churches, built around the turn of the century, are open 24 hours a day.
In 1972, sometime later in that year, Philip Moose, an artist in Blowing Rock, had a party for all of his artist friends, and he invited Ben Long to the party, and he invited Fulton Hodge, the pastor here, the rector, to the same party. And I've accused Philip of setting up a situation to get Frescoes here in the mountains, and he said, not exactly. He said he got the two men together to see what would happen. Well, they were introduced at this party, and Ben Long said to Fulton Hodge, I would like to paint a fresco in your church. Fulton Hodge said, paint a fresco in our church? We can't even afford to pay the electric bill. How can we afford to pay for a fresco? And Ben Long said, I'll do it free. And Father Hodge said, we'll take it. And that's how it all started.
Well, those mountain churches came about because, first of all, my family was living in Blowing Rock at the time, and that's where I was from. And we met. I had been studying fresco in Italy under a master there. And when I came back home, I naturally wanted to find some way to use this new information.
In 1974, 2 years later, Ben Long came up to the mountains, and he came to St. Mary's, and he did Mary Great with Child. Then he did John the Baptist, and then the Mystery of Faith, which is my favorite, down at St. Mary's. In 1980, he came to this church, And by then they had restored the wall. I understand there's a brick wall behind there. And they prepared this wall to receive the fresco of the Lord's Supper. Well, the wall was completed, and I'm going to tell you now how you do a fresco. First, the wall is covered, or the surface you're going to do a fresco on is covered with a plaster mixture of sand, lime, and water. And it's allowed to dry or cure for 3 months. After it is dry, the artist begins to paint. Now what he does, he prepares a sketch that he calls a cartoon. And the sketch is the same size as the fresco he's going to paint. He cuts the sketch up into pieces he can paint in one day, because everything has to be done while the plaster is wet. So next thing he does, he puts a piece of wet plaster on the area of the wall where he's going to paint that day. And I want to direct your attention to the stool. He would put a piece of wet plaster about this size where he's going to do that stool. He puts the cartoon or sketch on top of the wet plaster. He pushes a medium through holes in the sketch that are punched along the legs of the stool and the seat, so that he has an outline once he pulls the sketch off. He has an outline to paint by. Then he begins painting, and he can't stop until the painting is done, because if the plaster dries while he's still painting, it ruins it. He can't finish it. Over on the ledge here are the implements of the Exodus, of the Passover meal. You see the bone and various things there that represent the Exodus, which is a deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt, and also says something about our deliverance as Christians from sin. And then the rope up here is about the bondage, how we're delivered from bondage when we become Christians. The floating cloth at the top, Ben Long didn't want to put a dove there. Everybody puts a dove there. He put a floating cloth up there, and he would allow us to decide what we would want to make it. We can make it anything we want. I think I've covered most everything. You have the disciples sitting at the table with Jesus. Jesus' face is purposely blurred. It's not a clear face, because that was done on purpose. The people in the fresco of the Lord's Supper were people living in Ashe County in 1980. It's their faces. Well, the name of this church is St. Mary's, and it was named that by Bishop Cheshire in the early part of this century. He didn't like St. Simon the Zealot quite as much, so he named it St. Mary's. And that is why we chose Mary, Great with Child, to be the first fresco in this church, since the name of the church is St. Mary's. This church was actually built around 1905, and it has chestnut wood on its interior. This was the church where he painted, or Ben Long painted, the first fresco of Mary, Great with Child. He did so well with this first fresco that he won the Leonardo da Vinci Award for that. It does not show the day lines. And the actual body of that fresco of Mary is Fenelong's wife, who was pregnant at the time. And then in 1975, everyone liked what he did so well. He came back and did John the Baptist on the other side of the church. And one night there was a thunder clap and lightning, and it evidently struck very close to here and put a line right across John the Baptist's neck. And of course, as you recall, he was beheaded. And you can see it if you get close to it. And we were able to find money to pay Fenelong for this fresco. In those days, he wasn't too expensive. There's a bee down in the lower right-hand corner, which John fed on locusts and wild honey. And so here's a little bee down in the right-hand corner that most people don't see. There's a dove over top of John, the dove that came down upon Jesus as he baptized him. In Mary, you have an eclipse of the sun up here on the upper above her. And what is so special about Mary is that I've never seen a photograph of Mary pregnant facing you. I've always seen her sitting on a donkey with her back towards you. And this is the only one to this day I have ever seen of Mary pregnant. It actually shows the lines, it shows everything, and which I think is a magnificent painting. And then in 1977, he came back and did the Mystery of Faith, which you see the resurrected Jesus ascending behind the crucified Jesus. And I've caught people in the church here in tears as they gazed on that fresco. God really uses that fresco, I believe, more than any other to touch people's hearts. And this, of course, is the church where the man was running from the law and was converted at 3 o'clock in the morning. All alone in this church. The Mystery of Faith, which is behind me, as I said, is my favorite fresco. And it touches me deeply because he's up there for me. He's dying on that cross for me as if I was the only human being on earth. And he loved me so much that he went to that cross for me. And that's what it means to me. Also, the fact that death was not the end, that he rose again. And I know that I have that to look forward to one day, to be with him in that resurrected state.
Those mountain churches are one of the reasons I really wanted to do a fresco up there, is that I think they truly represent the spirit of the people in that particular area. And of course, it's one in which I always feel an immediate affinity to in terms of a true, strong, spiritual pull. I mean, those churches in their simplicity and their beauty are things I think that even for those who may not be of the same persuasion, I think they're so obviously beautiful and so integrated in the beauty of the countryside that it's not something that should be lost. And of course, when we were doing those paintings in those mountain churches, again, the idea was to save those churches. I think by doing it in St. Mary's of the Hills, we saved it from being moved, because at the time I think they were trying to put the big road right through there, and they managed to move it on the other side of that ridge line.
Speed well seems a proper exhortation to religious pilgrims passing along the back roads of the southern Appalachians. And so it is that visitors are greeted by this modest frame church in rural Jackson County. However, Speedwell is the place as well as the name of the Speedwell Baptist Church, lettered in strong black script over the church doorway. Speedwell Baptist Church, established in 1902 by Askew Carson Queen, a prominent Baptist minister, takes further distinction not only for its cheerful name, but for its architectural significance as one of Jackson County's most elaborate small rural chapels. Of special interest is the unusual 3-level octagonal tower with a flaring wide-eaved roofline, capped by distinctive scalloped tin shingles. Crossnore Presbyterian Church is built entirely by river rock hauled with great effort from a location nearby. The stone church was built from 1924 to 1925 by Uncle Will Franklin. Franklin, then 70 years old, was a self-taught stonemason. Will Franklin's labor of faith and love is an incredible feat of workmanship, both inside and out. The first worship service was held at Crossnore Presbyterian Church on August 8, 1926, and continues actively today.
Uncle Will Franklin was a local. He was 70 years old when he started the church. I'm told that he could not read and write. His son, McCoy Franklin, was the first pastor of the church. And then our grandson is an Episcopal priest in Athens, Georgia. And the stone was taken from the Linville River, just about a mile from here, brought up here by wagon or oxen on a stone bolt. And it was all local work. The inside is a chestnut bark off of the chestnut trees that surrounded the church. They would take the bark off when it was green, would lay it on planks, lay planks on top of the bark, and then heavy stones, and press it out till it dried out so they could saw the wood up into the dimensions they wanted. It was founded by the Doctor's Sloop, Dr. and Mrs. Dr. Sloop, in 1918. There are many, many weddings in here because it is such a beautiful church. There's a reunion or a homecoming each July of every summer. The cemetery joins the church property here, and where there are many, many of the old-timers buried. The Sloops are buried there. And there's just a lot of tradition and warmth and feeling about the church. We're now in the process of being put on the historic register, and I can't wait for that to happen so that the church will be preserved forever, I hope.
The Crossroads community of Plum Tree in Avery County grew up around lovely little Plum Tree Presbyterian Church. The church was established about 1905 in conjunction with the Plum Tree School for Boys. Unfortunately, the school was later destroyed by fire, but experienced a rebirth as part of the original school known today as Lees McRae College in nearby Banner Elk. But Plum Tree Church itself has endured relatively unchanged for almost a century. The attractive wood frame exterior, ornamented windows, and scenic pastoral setting drew the attention of the film industry in the 1980s. The Winter People, a film based on North Carolina native John Ely's book of the same name, starred Kurt Russell and Kelly McGillis and featured locations in and around Plum Tree. Picturesque St. David's Episcopal Church near Cullowhee is highly significant as one of only 6 examples of Gothic Revival architecture in Jackson County. The stuccoed brick church, constructed in 1887, is highlighted by a steeply pitched roof, a large, gracefully ornamented overdoor, and symmetrically placed lancet windows on all sides. When the Episcopal parish in this Cullowhee Valley dwindled in the early 1930s, St. David's was eventually closed and was deconsecrated in 1941. However, new life emerged in 1958 when Dr. Rufus Morgan of Cullowhee took a personal interest in this lovely church. Funds were secured to restore the church, and it was finally reconsecrated December 9, 1959. The weathered stones of St. David's Cemetery are nearby. On a busy street corner directly across from the Macon County Courthouse in Murphy is the Episcopal Church of the Messiah. The congregation of this attractive wood-framed church with Gothic arched windows was originally organized in 1855. The cornerstone for the present church was laid in 1896. This church, with its architecturally interesting interior and unusual decorative elements, is a fine example of what mountain determination can achieve.
When this church was originally started, it was put under the The person who was put in charge of building the church was a person by the name of James Washington Fletcher, and he was very much a perfectionist. The interior of the church is of Georgia heart of pine in a herringbone pattern. The original church building was designed by Reverend F.W. Way in the style of the 18th and 19th century English chapels. The original roof on the church was of shingles, and the outside was just of frame construction. Later on, a decorative tin roof was added, and some other improvements have been made over the years. One of the things that we are very proud of is the Tiffany stained glass windows that were acquired by Fanny Morgan with the help of some of her friends in New York in the 1920s. Fanny and Alfred Morgan were very much responsible for getting the church built. Mr. Morgan was a printer and was the editor of the local newspaper here in Murphy. And one way that they raised money to build the church, Fanny had him print out cards with little circles in them the size of a quarter. And she sent those cards to everybody that she could think of for donations. And so those cards came back filled, and they were able to raise the $1,800 that this church originally cost to build it.
High up in Allegheny County is the humble little New River Missionary Baptist Church. This unusual stone church, founded in 1943, is a legacy of the Blue Ridge Parkway, which runs nearby. The parkway, begun as a Depression-era make-work project in 1935, employed not only local men in search of work in those hard economic times, but also brought master stonemasons to this country from Italy. These exceptionally skilled artisans crafted the network of stone bridges and stone abutments that line the parkway. One of these talented Italians, Ed Rosati, is credited with completing the distinctive stonework of this unique little house of worship. The Hickory Nut Gorge area just east of Hendersonville is surrounded on all sides by mighty rock cliffs and towering peaks, such as the prominent pinnacle Chimney Rock. Nestled on a scenic hilltop in the gorge near Bat Cave is the lovely Episcopal Church of the Transfiguration. Begun as a mission in 1896 by Mother Eva and the Sisters of the Order of Transfiguration, this pious house of worship with its European influence and Anglican cruciform design was no doubt built of local river rock. Religious life was central to the everyday life of early mountaineers. It's not surprising that for many, the personal spiritual cornerstone in this rugged wilderness was the Bible, the Word of God, easing the uncertainty of isolation, offering solace and wisdom in difficult times. The family Bible made its way across oceans, up winding mountain paths and rocky hillsides, and on its pages were faithfully recorded the enduring web of family history. Marriages, births, deaths. In a time when books were few and scarce as gold, the family Bible also became a school book. As twilight descended and the mist covered the mountaintops, cabins filled with a chorus of children's voices, dutifully reciting Bible verses at hearthside, pages lit by the glow of firelight, learning their ABCs from the account of the Great Flood or the wonder of the Christmas story, discipline from the 10 Commandments.
The earliest churches were typically log, one room, an open plan, because most of the pioneer dwellings were log. Naturally, the churches were log. But over time, say by the late 19th century, churches were built more typically of frame as sawmills became more common and finished lumber was available. And then that changed again in the early 20th century. Building became more complex, I'd say. Frame, stone, and brick churches appear in the southern Appalachians. By the early 20th century, the Gothic Revival, which was the predominant style for churches, remained intact. And then you see a little bit of influence of the Romanesque style with more rounded arch windows. But again, the Gothic did remain the predominant style and influence throughout the region. The Episcopalians really brought to the fore the use of the Gothic Revival style in the mid-19th century. And I think they chose that because it had a sort of a medieval appearance, and it was a style that really gave some stability in a sort of changing society, and that they sort of wanted to be anchored to that medieval feeling. And that really influenced all the other denominations in the region, and even Baptist, Methodist sort of adopted the influence of the style, not the high style Gothic, but that influence. The Baptist churches were overall more plain than some of the other denominations, Episcopalians or Methodists. Again, simple lines, simple, clean, very clean, yet elegant in a restrained sort of way. But even the churches that have adopted the Gothic Revival, you see small belfries with conical or pyramidal roofs. And then in the Romanesque, you see more of a rounded arch instead of that pointed, and banded windows. And often the Romanesque is executed in stone, in native stone, which is real appropriate to this area, especially in some of the resort areas where they wanted to sort of convey that rustic sense of rusticity, and they were executed in stone with maybe bark-covered or twig embellishments on the exterior, which is a real unique feature in this area. In my experience, most of the churches in the rural areas were built by local carpenters, maybe based on a standardized plan. There are churches in the area designed by architects, but most of the work done by local carpenters who built not only churches but houses and other buildings. And again, the availability of mass-produced lumber really led to a building boom starting in the late 19th century of churches. And as congregations split and grew and population grew, then there was a building boom of churches in that period, and that availability of those materials just heightened that whole activity.
Most of the materials on a frame church like this would have been gathered locally. They would have been sawn or treated or trimmed or dressed at a local mill and brought down, pulled by horse and wagon, would have been cut locally, rough cut, and brought back up to the site where they would have been dressed or trimmed. In some cases, you might even find that the wood used in the church was drawn from the site. But that would be determined by the accessibility to the lumberyard. The beams that support this on the dry-laid stone would have been cut on the site with an adze or an axe, and it would have been a felled tree that would have been seasoned, so you have a significant amount of time involved, and would have been hand-dressed on the site and laid up on stones that were probably picked up from around the site itself. Presumably in a situation like this, all the materials would have been gathered over a considerable period of time to make sure everything was necessary in order to construct the church, and would have been brought to the site, at which point a local builder or an individual that has experience in building would have led crews, would have led the congregation, I should say, in the construction of the church. And I don't have any idea of how many days or weeks or months it would have taken, but the man hours and the toil was considerable. With few exceptions, most of the local stone churches or churches in western North Carolina were laid up with a rough cut stone. So it is not as though they were drawn from a riverbed. Crossnor is an example where they were drawn from a riverbed. But they were rough cut at the quarries and trimmed out and defined and cut to size, if necessary, at the site. Again, an enormous amount of man and animal resource, in this case, would have always been involved in constructing either a stone foundation or actually stone walls all the way up to roof line. We today use hydraulic equipment and both to cut it and to shape it, to form it, to lift it. All of that was done by just man resources, clearly. There were obviously a limitation as to how much you could put in a horse-drawn wagon and brought up to a particular site, but it all had to be done that way, so it would have been multiple trips, not only in terms of gathering the materials, but trying to get them to the site itself. A much more difficult project than we would even consider today.
Tucked contentedly back in a leafy wood on a gentle hill in rural Transylvania County near Brevard is the old McGaha Chapel. Once known as the Little River Methodist Church, this classically beautiful little church house has a long and treasured history.
I was born in this area, but my family moved away. When I first came back to this church, I remember I was about 10 years old. I'm not positive. The minister was a circuit rider, and he would come to our house on a train from Buncombe County, and we would bring him out here on Sundays. And it was a wonderful day. We looked forward to having his coming to church. And this was a church my mother and father were married in 1904. So it meant a lot to us and has through the years.
I think it's always important for us to trace our history and to realize the foundation that others have laid for us. It's always important for us to realize that there are others who have gone on before us and have carried on the faith and brought it to our day and time, and that history has a very important measure in looking at the church today. What always impressed me when I've seen other structures of this size and type is that it's just a reminder that there are a lot of dedicated, deeply committed Christian people who have put in a lot of hard work, a lot of effort, and have made a lot of sacrifices. And I think McGaha Chapel is another indication of that commitment and dedication of people who have gone before us. And to know that our roots at First United Methodist Church in Brevard come back out here to this chapel. Very important, very significant.
One of the significant aspects to this structure and the fact that it still exists today is based on its very simple design. Without it, were it a more complicated church, given the minimal amount of resources to maintain it, it would not be existing today. There are several issues regarding framing that historically have provided have weathered well, for the lack of a better word. There are 8x8 or 8x10 hand-hewn structural beams that are laid up on dry stacked stones for the undercarriage, the framing foundation of the building. And true dimension 2x4 rough-cut wood studs that support the roof assembly. You can see that there are large eaves and frieze boards that provide for protection of the siding and the windows and all the openings. The steeply pitched roof provides good drainage, whether it be from snow or rain. The lack of a full foundation allows for proper air circulation. Primarily, the structure is cut pine. This particular church reflects more of a Greek revival or an early Methodism. I think that the overall form of this church is in keeping with 19th century Methodist church. It's very simple and unadorned on the front elevation. It's not strict. It's a soft elevation with minimal amount of detail. Particularly in rural areas where there was a vernacular, a tradition of building that was handed down throughout a community. Buildings were built with an understanding of why you were building that were more important many times than strictly what the architectural design or the aesthetics of a structure was. As you walk into a church like this, you say it is stark and unadorned, but upon closer examination, you can see significant efforts at providing details and a finish to this church, albeit very rural and made strictly of local materials. There are indications in these fairly rustic pews that they were hand hewn, hand constructed. After they were put together, the corners were then chamfered not only to soften the edges, but also to provide a decorative element. We have what I would call a dovetail locking mechanism here that extends in probably about an inch or two, and by driving this wedge form in, it locks the seat, which is walnut, about 1.5 inches to 1.75 inches in thickness, up against this side panel to assist it in tightening and keep tight the pew itself. We also have attempts at providing some decorative elements on these just flat-butted wall panels, and that was painting a pediment above the windows as is reflected from the outside. Plus, you notice that a frieze board or a crown was put at the top of these batten walls, and they too have been drawn with a molding plane. So there are a lot of elements in this church, to me, indicate an effort at refining elements, albeit it looks just absolutely stark.
When churches are allowed to deteriorate and there's that loss of that important architectural fabric, it has a detrimental effect, I think, on communities. Churches are often sort of the binding element of a community, and when that's lost, there's an important relationship that is lost. But fortunately, through some federal and state programs, such as the National Register of Historic Places, historic churches are recognized and preserved, and people get involved in that preservation, and that's a positive thing for the church and the community that surrounds the church.
A rustic shagbark exterior shelters the tiny sanctuary of St. John's Episcopal Church in the Macon County countryside near Franklin. This reconstruction was completed in the late 1940s by Reverend Rufus Morgan. Built with his own hands on the site of the original St. John's Episcopal Church, the work was a labor of love for Reverend Morgan, an Episcopal priest. The church was also a tribute to his own parents, who were members of the original congregation. The foundation stones of St. John's are said to be 19th century gravestones. A cemetery nearby also contains grave markers of 2 Cherokee Indian chiefs. This charming country church is distinctly different from most of those encountered on the back roads of the southern Appalachians. Reams Creek Presbyterian Church near Weaverville in Buncombe County is highlighted by its unusual pebble dash exterior and was designed by noted Asheville Society architect Richard Sharp Smith around 1900. Smith was an associate of Richard Morris Hunt, architect of the magnificent Biltmore Estate near Asheville. The design of Reams Creek Presbyterian Church reflects the elegant architectural style of its contemporary, Biltmore Estate. Reverend David Bierschwal ministers to the congregation of Reams Creek Presbyterian, as well as the rock-clad Presbyterian Church at Beach, just 2 miles distant at the head of this scenic valley near the Blue Ridge Parkway, north of Weaverville.
The Reams Creek Presbyterian congregation dates back to the late 18th century. A lot of the Scotch-Irish immigrants came into this valley as they crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains. And so it was one of the first 3 Presbyterian congregations west of the Blue Ridge. The congregation dates back to 1791. That's the date or the time period when folks started meeting as a congregation. This congregation, throughout the Civil War, seemed to side with the Union cause. After the Civil War, the Presbyterian Church split into the north and the south. There was There's, of course, a lot of debate about that, and finally the congregation decided to side with the northern church. So that made it quite unique in this particular region. This structure was built, completed in 1902. Much of the sanctuary is as it was built. The doors are original doors, the beautiful doorknobs and other the hinges and things such as that. Really beautiful. They don't make things like that anymore, of course.
All Saints Episcopal Church in Linville was designed by noted architect Henry Bacon in 1910, an exquisite example of the rustic beauty of nature wedded to the inspirational beauty of faith. This little church, surrounded by trees in a lovely wisteria-draped arbor, is sheathed inside and out with natural rough-cut chestnut bark siding, a distinctive architectural style commonly found here in North Carolina's high country prior to the chestnut blight of the 1920s. The entry is highlighted by a sturdy European-style wooden door. The unusual interior of All Saints Church seems to bring the outside in, seeming to create literally a holy sanctuary under the trees. The volume ceiling moves the eye up to the unique rafters and supporting beams, which are simply and beautifully cut, unpeeled timbers, highlighted by the random knots and curves found in nature. Exquisitely rendered stained glass images, a simple crucifix over the entrance, and a richly colored depiction of Jesus with a little child just back of the altar seem to illuminate the natural beauty of All Saints Episcopal Church in Linville, a church derived from nature and inspired by God.
Happy to be here to reminisce a little bit and see.
The spirit of these old churches survives, although many of the structures do not exist as they once were. Begun in 1910, Erwin Hills Baptist Church near Asheville in Buncombe County is a fine example of the growth of a church. Not so much in the spread of its church building, which now wears the sturdy brick exterior found on many rural churches since the 1950s, but in the fact of its very survival.
Our church, first church, was West End Baptist Church. It was built in 1910, and Rockefeller got off of the train right down below the church and walked up to where they were building the building, and the men said they didn't have enough money to put a roof on the building, so Rockefeller gave the church the money to have the roof put on the building. The building burned down in 1937.
Through it all, the church family at Erwin Hills persevered, multiplied, grew strong. These traditional gatherings of the church family are much the same today as a century ago. Homecoming.
Homecoming means getting together with all these good friends of mine, and all the people always be my friends, and we always with God, and God helps us along a whole lot.
It takes me 2 days to bake for the homecoming. You know, I start on Thursday night or Friday morning, and I bake till Saturday night till late.
And this is a fresh coconut cake. I mean, it's fresh. And that's made by Elton Wright. And this is Miss Ruth Owens, peach cobbler.
I believe it's that right. And let me tell you something, you can eat anything around here you want to, you're welcome to it. I will. That's my cake.
Father, mother, sister, brother, sons and daughters, and babes in arms, sharing God's bounty, taking joy in fellowship, preserving a cultural heritage. Tradition continues. The old lead the young. The past leads to the future of the church, and the family of man. Like sentinels across the landscape, the old country churches of the Southern Appalachians preserve the cultural heritage of the mountains, its people, its faith. Built upon the rock.